Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 846 of the Juicebox Podcast. Welcome back to another episode of Best of Juicebox. Today's episode you may have heard on April 26, 2001. It's called Bolusing Insulin for Fat. It's with Michelle from the popular blog Waltzing the Dragon. And Michelle and I spend this entire episode talking about how fat sometimes needs insulin. Do you ever see a rise after a cheeseburger and fries and not know what's happening? I bet you have. Listen in, you're going to find out more and find out how to take care of it. While you're listening today, please remember that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Please always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. Don't forget to take the T1D Exchange survey. Please complete that survey at t1dexchange.org/juicebox. And these episodes don't have ads on them right now, so I'm doing something special. I'm going to tell you about it as soon as the music's over. But don't forget that generally speaking, the podcast is supported by a ton of great advertisers, all of whom have links in the show notes of your podcast player and at juiceboxpodcast.com. I had this idea, since these episodes don't yet have advertising on them, although I'm open to selling it to someone, hint, hint, but since they don't at the moment, I thought I would give some ads to people who live with diabetes in their life. So with that in mind, today's episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Balance Chiropractic and Wellness. Dr. Jen is a longtime listener of the podcast. She has a young child with type 1 diabetes, and she's a chiropractor. So why don't you give her I don't want to say it. Why don't you let her take a crack at your back? I said it anyway. BalanceChiroandWellness.com. If you're in Iowa, I believe in the Des Moines area, look Jen up. 515-255-5330. All right, let's see who we have next. Oh, here's a good one. Lauren Powell, Powell Law Offices, Dallas-Fort Worth. Personal legal issues demand personal attention. Legal solutions that protect your future. 972-584-9382. Lauren's young child was just diagnosed very recently, just a couple of months ago. There you go. You need an attorney? Head to powelllawoffices.com. Let's do one more. Ed. Oh, here you go. Ed owns a family garden center in 40 Fort, Pennsylvania. 40 Fort, Pennsylvania. That can't be a real place, can it? I'm sure it is. edwardsgardencenter.com. I'm going to check out where this is at. Oh, lovely photos. Let's see. Contact. Oh, yeah, I'm not lying. It's in 40 Fort, PA. 570-287-4329. edwardsgardencenter.com. Check them out. Looks like they have ponds and water garden, gift shops, gardening supplies, lawn care. They have some animals on site you can see. There's bunnies. Ed says his brother, who's a part owner, has been a type 1 since age 12, and Ed's youngest son was just diagnosed in May at age 3. So if you're looking for garden center supplies type stuff, edwardsgardencenter.com. And I mean, otherwise, you just want to go to a place called 40 Fort. 40, F-O-R-T-Y, Fort, F-O-R-T. Fantastic. What a great name for a town. All right, we'll do more of those next week during the next best of. But for now, this is episode 471, which originally aired on April 26, 2001 with Michelle. And it's called Bolusing Insulin for Fat. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 471 of the Juicebox Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about bolusing for fat in your food. And it might be easier than you think to figure out. Michelle is here from the website Waltzing the Dragon to try to help us understand. If you're thinking right now, wait, that doesn't make any sense. There are no carbs in fat. I only bolus for carbs. Well, you ever eat pizza and get a weird high 3 hours later? French fries? Milkshake? Anything like that? Where you think it's gone, you've handled it, but suddenly 2 and 3 hours later, this persistent high? If that's happened to you, you're going to love this episode. And let's be honest, if you're using insulin, this has happened to you. We're going to get started in just a moment, but first I'd like to remind you that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Please always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. I'd also like to say right up front that I've put a link in the show notes and a link at juiceboxpodcast.com to Michelle's website. And that link will take you directly to everything that we've spoken about today and the way Michelle talks about it on her space. But I think this conversation will be enlightening, and I hope you enjoy it. At the very end of this episode, I will actually read from Michelle's site in case the conversational nature of today's show didn't let you take notes or kind of walk through things incrementally. So after you hear the whole thing, at the very end, I'll walk you through it one more time. All right, a little more music and we'll get started. This show is sponsored today by the glucagon that my daughter carries, Gvoke HypoPen. Find out more at gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. The podcast is also sponsored by the Contour NEXTONE blood glucose meter. You can find out if you're eligible for a free meter. Check into Contour's test strip program, or, well, there's a lot more you can do, so I can't just list it all. But all the information you need about the Contour NEXTONE meter, it's at contournext.com/juicebox. There's links in your show notes, links at juiceboxpodcast.com. Let's talk about bolusing for fat now with Michelle.
My name is Michelle, and I am the mom of two kids, Gemma, who is 12, just turned 12, and Max, who is 13. It's Max who has type 1 diabetes. He was diagnosed at just over a year in 2007. Actually, 14 months to the day.
Wow.
Was how old he was.
Wow, that's pretty damn young. Jeez. That
It
wasn't
is
fun,
young.
huh?
It was tough. I think it's tough at any age. I think they're just different challenges.
Oh, I agree with that. Yeah, I agree that it's that it's not like, oh, I got lucky. I was diagnosed at 46. Perfect age to be like, that's not how
Right.
it is. But that 14 months thing with the low body weight, not being able to communicate well, it's just and back then, I mean, you didn't even have the ability to break boluses down into smaller bits. And
No, although he got his first pump at 3 years old.
mm-hmm.
So that's when things really changed in terms of being able to break it down. But before that, for the first 2 years, we used diluted insulin to try and get smaller boluses, like really half as much as you could drop in a syringe.
Yeah.
I don't know if you did that with Arden. I know she was quite young too. Was she 2 years old?
She was just after her second birthday. What I did was I took expired insulin, squirted it into a dish, added food coloring to it, drew it up into a needle, and I would practice pushing the plunger slightly to make a drop come out. I just used the food coloring so I could see the liquid and then kind of think about, okay, this much pressure made a drop come out. And that way, when I used insulin for real and the needle was in Arden, I could put that same pressure on.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was a good motivator to put weight on her. That's for sure.
I bet. We're still trying. Max is skinny as a rail. And I'm like, where can we put these infusion sets? We need some fat.
No kidding. Oh, that's something.
Yeah.
Well, do you know how you ended up on this podcast today? Do you listen enough that
you messaged me and I responded.
Okay. So
I'm guessing Jenny had something to do with it.
Right. So Jenny and I sat down. So I can pull the curtain back here a little bit. Like people listening hear Jenny like every couple of weeks on the show or something like that.
She is awesome.
She's my favorite person. But what I do to make that for everybody is Jenny and I carve out some time and we power through topics. And I do not tell her what we're going to talk about first. So
I heard you say that.
yes. So I said, okay, like we finished a topic and I said, hey, Jenny, next I want to talk about how to translate fat into carbs for bolusing. And she goes, I don't think I'm the right person for that. And I said, oh, okay, that's no problem. And I just put it on my list, like find somebody else. And she says, do you know that blog? And then she told me about your blog, which of course I know because of the unique name, but tell people your blog title.
So the website is Waltzing the Dragon. And it was started in 2011 with another diabetes mom. Danielle and I started it because we realized that when we talked to other parents, we just got the most helpful tips. Like other parents knew how to put the theory into practice. Yeah. They knew what kind of infusion sets worked. They knew, how to get around things like you're talking about, food coloring and making some really small boluses when you're still using syringes. That's the kind of stuff that we learned from other parents. And we just thought, wouldn't it be awesome if we had a place where the theory and those practical tips existed in one place, where I could look up, illness management strategies at 2 a.m. while my kid's throwing up. And they would be there. I wasn't like shuffling through that junk drawer looking for that handout that I got.
Yeah.
So that's where Waltzing the Dragon came from.
It's interesting. I don't want to go too far into the weeds here, but it's interesting that you can't just devise one repository and it exists everywhere, because that's not how people find out about things. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like the best movie I've ever seen in my life, you may never have seen or ever heard of. And so that other places keep popping up is a gift to people, because the internet is sort of cyclical, and at the same time it's bubbled. Like you're in a sphere, you don't realize it. You're not seeing the whole internet, you're seeing the part of it you see. So if somebody Sure. has a blog like yours, that's great. And it can be frustrating for people listening. I imagine Michelle has felt this before too, known how valuable the information you have is, and you can't figure out how to get it to more people because you're not in charge of that. And I figured that out a long time ago. If people don't know immediately to go to the ADA to get information about something, right, then that means that the ADA's information isn't so amazing that everyone who's ever seen it runs around telling everybody else about it, right? Which is not to denigrate their information. It's just that that's not how it works. It's why you see somebody who's incredibly popular on Instagram today, who 11 months from now, you'll never see again, because everything just keeps going. But I always felt badly about like all this great information that just, it just kind of, it cycles away. And so the podcast for me is an idea of like, how do you bring it alive so that it keeps existing and it keeps drawing people in and they keep finding it. So as soon as Jenny said the name of your blog, I was like, I've heard that name a million times. Now, I don't read diabetes blogs, and I never have, but that was always a creative decision. I didn't want to read something you wrote and then find myself saying it and not realize that I had heard it from somebody else, right? So right. I always stayed very kind of insulated around it. But immediately I was like, because how can you not remember that name? Like Waltzing the Dragon is just so, unique. So anyway, I go there. No, please. And there's all that information. And I was like, okay, I'm going to send someone an email and ask. And I picked around. I think I figured out how to get to you through Facebook. So I really appreciate you doing this, because I want to take what you know about this one specific subject and kind of blow it up and leave it here inside of the podcast for other people. So
awesome.
Yeah. So tell me how you first realized that fat made blood sugar go up.
What would happen is we would go somewhere like McDonald's. Like we had good control. I wouldn't say it was fantastic, but our overnights were good. We knew how to handle the kind of foods that we made at home. Max was pretty little, so we weren't eating a whole lot of high fat food. And then when we started to, like I said, go to McDonald's or have a pizza, we would have these incredibly high, persistent highs that I just kept correcting, and he wasn't coming down. And it was changing, like it was frustrating for me. And it was changing our family's lifestyle. Like I felt like diabetes was winning I felt like, okay, we're not going to go to McDonald's and get fries today because I don't want to deal with the high later. We're not going to have pizza tonight because I don't want to deal with being up all night and correcting. And that was incredibly frustrating to me because we've always lived like diabetes, we have to pay attention to it, but it's not going to control us. And it was definitely controlling our family.
Yeah.
So I went looking for ways that I could cope with that. And within a couple weeks of each other, two different people brought up this idea of bolusing for protein and fat. Shannon, who was one of the CDEs, one of the nurses at the Alberta Children's Hospital Diabetes Clinic, which is where Max is seen. And also Lorraine Anderson, who is a registered dietitian here in Canada. She worked for, at the time, Animus was my son's pump company. And so I'd had contact with her over that. They both brought up this idea of bolusing for protein and fat, which we had never done. But it seemed perfect. And it seemed almost divine that they were both talking about it at a time when I really needed to hear it.
Yeah.
So we started experimenting as a family. And just to back up, I guess that's, I remember talking at a conference and people said, well, wait a sec. I guess I should start bolusing for fat because we've never done that. And through the conversation, it came to be that they didn't really have post-meal highs due to fat or protein. So I was like, well, then if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Right.
I mean, you don't need to do this unless you're seeing this pattern that is one aspect of diabetes management that you would like to address. But many people, if you eat the same amount of protein in most meals or the same amount of fat in most meals, then you don't need to do anything different. Right. Your insulin to carb ratios and your basal rates after that are probably covering it just fine. I think the problem for us as a family was that we tended to eat not low fat, but we didn't binge very often on things like pizza or, burgers and fries at McDonald's. And so when we did, I could really see the difference.
Yeah. Well, almost divinely, yesterday Arden had a Five Guys double cheeseburger with bacon, French fries, and a milkshake. So she took her SAT and she came out of the SAT and she's like, I want some food. And I was like, okay. Actually, she took a SAT prep class and the guy said, when she's done, she's going to want to eat and take a nap. And I was like, oh, you don't know Arden, right? Like she won't. Boom. She ate this food, walked upstairs and fell asleep.
Took the nap.
But what I knew.
He's seen a few of these kids, right?
He's aware of what was going to happen. But what I knew for certain was, much like you, Arden's not going to have a cheeseburger every day, right? It's not going to be a meal like that every day. So now we have these fries that are potatoes, which we know are difficult to bolus for, soaked in peanut oil. There's the protein in the burger plus the fat in the burger. There's cheese, there's bacon, then there's bread. And then she has it's a milkshake, a real milkshake, like real ice cream, in a milkshake. And she says,
not ice milk, but ice cream.
Can I get can I get a milkshake with Oreo pieces and Oreo cream? So they put the ice cream in and then they scoop in chunks of Oreos and extra cream of Oreos, right? So what that tells me in my head, the way I think about it is that the range of time that this meal is going to impact her, in my mind, goes right up to about 5 or 6 hours. Like that's how I first think about it. And then I just dump in as much insulin up front as I think she can handle. And then any indication that there's going to be a rise gets reattacked along the way. The problem is when people are saying, well, how do I bolus for fat and protein? That's not a real, that's more of a, here's what I do. You can try to see if it works for you. Do you have more of a formula for something like that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's not my formula.
No.
But let me back up because,
Please.
I've heard you talk about how you do like a temp basal to deal with those sort of rises that come from food. And we tried that. Danielle, the other original co-founder of Waltzing the Dragon, that's what she did with her son.
Right.
Is she would set a temp basal after the meal for, whatever in her gut said was the right amount. And she had done all this experimentation. But when I tried it, it was an abysmal failure.
Okay.
Like I tend to be very systematic anyway. I'm not a kind of let's see what this does. I want to have something concrete. You and I are probably the yin to the other's yang. But in any case, we tried it a couple of times and it just didn't work. Either he bottomed out or he was still super high later. And I thought, I do not have the mental energy that it's going to take to experiment with these rates and ratios and pull numbers out of the air for the next 2 years until we get it right. I just don't.
Right.
And so what both Shannon and Lorraine had brought to me was what's called the Warsaw School program. In Eastern Europe. They bolus for carbs, just like we do here in North America, but there's also more of a practice of bolusing for protein and fat. So they've spent some time figuring out, well, what does that look like?
Yeah.
And so that was the program that I did more research on. And so what they basically say is that protein is kind of complicated. Protein creates in your body, creates some insulin, but it also stimulates the release of glucagon, which we know raises blood sugar. And so the effect of it is like if all you ate was protein, the effect is a longer rise in blood sugar, longer after you eat it. So it might be 3 to 5 hours if all you ate was protein without carbs. Yep. It might be 3 to 5 hours. You give maybe an extended bolus or a temp basal of, I don't know, maybe 3 hours. I think Jenny said something like 50%. I'm trying to remember. She had a great way of looking at it. You do that after the meal, and then it covers that slow rise of protein. So that's part of what they talk about. Then they also talk about the effect of fat, which is not at all unpredictable. Fat raises blood sugar. And the reason is you get insulin resistant. You've got fat in your bloodstream that makes your insulin less efficient, but you've also got that fat is harder to break down. So it takes longer to digest. So what we found with Max was that when he would eat a high protein / high fat meal, he would go low first, and then he'd be soaringly high. Mm-hmm. And the reason was, if we gave all of that bolus up front, so let's say he had a cheeseburger and fries, and that would be, let me think, like maybe at that age, it was like the McDonald's Happy Meal. So it might have been like, I don't know, 40 grams of carbs for the fries. And then the burger might have been another 20. So we're talking about, let's say 60 grams of carbs. And with that would come maybe 40 grams of fat. I'll say 30 at that age. So we would give the bolus for the 60 grams of carbs, which you would think, okay, that's great. If he just eaten the bun and potatoes that weren't, as you say, soaked in peanut oil, right. Then that bolus up front would have covered that and everything would be great if we do the correct timing of the insulin and all that. But what's happening is because there's such a high fat content, it's digesting more slowly. So that initial bolus is all getting in before all of the food gets in. So he'd go low first, which of course we would correct. And then that correction would add to his high blood sugar later.
Yeah, right.
So then we were fighting both.
Because it's so incredibly difficult to say to yourself, oh, I've gotten the meal insulin ahead of the impact of the meal. Now I'm going to correct with food. I actually have to bolus the correction right now. That is a hard leap to make in your mind. But
I have to bolus that correction with an extended bolus. Or perhaps if you're still on injections with like a split bolus.
Because I need it to
Because if I bolus it now, he may go low again. And we found that depends on the amount of fat too. Like we don't do this. We won't even consider the amount of fat if it's under about 10 to 15 grams.
Okay.
So under 10, I don't even think about it. 10 to 15, maybe, depends what else has been going on in his day. Has he been, fighting some highs? Has he been exercising hard? Whatever, then I might consider it. But over 15, we will almost always bolus for the fat.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Because that's where we see the impact.
Right.
So getting back to this Warsaw School,
yes, please.
What they do is they talk about fat protein units. Mm-hmm. And there's this process that they go through to calculate fat protein units. And I don't know, do you want me to, it's all on Waltzing the Dragon.
Oh, I'm looking at it right now.
Do you want me to go through it?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want me to go through it basically?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll just tell people now. Oh, geez. All right. So you're Canadian. So it's waltzingthedragon.ca. And I'm actually
.ca, although the .com will get you there too.
Okay. .com will get me there too. But on this specific page, it's got kind of a long title. So is there a quick way that you can tell people to get through your website to get to what you're going to talk about?
Yes, waltzingthedragon.ca/fat.
/fat. Okay. I'm doing it to waltzingthedragon.ca/fat. Okay. How fat and protein affect blood glucose. Okay. I'm here. Go ahead.
So there's 2 articles. The first one, that how fat and protein affect blood glucose, is sort of the introduction. It just talks about the fact, what we just talked about.
Right.
Protein will raise blood sugar slowly. Fat will make you insulin resistant and give you a resistant high later.
Okay.
And then the second article is how to reduce those spikes, or avoid them, might be a better word. Like if you use the Warsaw formula, then you can have a pretty close to flat line if you sort of tweak it enough for your own personal needs.
Yeah, if you actually go through and figure this out. So this episode really is for people who want to look at a nutrition label and say, I want to apply this to that. And I do want to agree with you before we start that I don't bolus for all the fat Arden needs. I do think, though, that it's an elusive idea to people, because I'll take a very basic example. Every once in a while, like once or twice a year, I make my own potato chips. That's how bored I get. Okay. Ooh. So you start with an amount of, I use peanut oil because it holds a nice steady temperature, right? And however much peanut oil you start with, you make your potato chips, you put your potato chips aside. Each one's thin and crispy and doesn't even have a hint of oil in it. But then you go back and look at how much oil's been absorbed by the potatoes, and it's a fascinating amount of oil, right? So
I bet.
If you eat handfuls of these potato chips, you might as well take a cup, fill it with peanut oil, and drink it, because
chug.
That's what you're doing eating those potato chips, right? As an example. Or a cheeseburger, or, all kinds of things like that have grease in them, have way more grease in them than you imagine.
Yes.
So, did I know fat from ice cream plus fat from cheese and fat from beef and oil from French fries and potatoes and bread was going to crush Arden? It did. And if I told you that based on the carb count of that meal, even though it was an insane carb amount, I mean, gosh, by the time you go through the burger, the roll's like 25, and then I just throw in 5 for the burger because why not, and a couple more for the cheese, and now I'm at 35, and then the fries are probably 50, and now I'm at 85, and the milkshake's probably like 80, and like in my mind I'm like, this is like 180 carbs, right? And even though you give that insulin for that, it comes back to haunt you like a bad ex.
Absolutely.
Every couple of hours.
Absolutely.
It's like and you're putting in another, it's going to happen again. Here's 2 or 3 more units. Before you know it, you've used by half more insulin than the actual carb count kind of would indicate.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
And the amount I've found since we've started bolusing for fat, I found that the amount of insulin we use up front as an extended bolus is a fraction of what we will have to use to correct it.
Right.
It's absolutely insane. Like we might add like a 3-unit extended bolus if we, do it at the front. If we forget to, or when we were learning this, we might have to use like 8 or 10 units to get him back down to range. And so the difference is just striking.
Right. There's all kinds
and doing it proactively is a huge benefit.
Well, being ahead of it, you're using far less than you will if you chase it. And
absolutely,
when you're ahead of it, you most likely won't cause a low later, because it's almost like that food, it almost precludes a low from happening. It's right. Almost the, it's sort of the antithesis of the idea when people are newly diagnosed, someone will tell you to like, oh, give them like a little protein and a fat at bedtime if you don't want their blood sugar to fall, like that kind of, that old chestnut, but except you're doing it times like 30. And so, so if you're very aggressive, the way I think about it is balancing the impact of the insulin or the impact of the carbs with the action of the insulin, and trying to keep everything working at the same time so that when the food's finally digested and the insulin's finally gone, you don't crash later.
Totally.
But yeah, once you're chasing fat and protein like this, especially high fat, you're just, it takes so much more insulin than you could imagine. And your basal rate is nowhere near up to the challenge that you've that you've given it now.
Absolutely.
All of a sudden. Okay.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry. I love our conversation, but I'm not letting you get to what you're trying to say. So
no, that's okay.
Good.
I just want to back up for a minute because
Please.
you mentioned a lot of things. Like if people are curious what sorts of things that we do this for, you've mentioned a lot of them. Like we talked about pizza, we talked about burgers, cheeseburgers, French fries. Funny, if we have if we have homemade frozen French fries made in the oven, they don't have enough fat and we don't need to worry about it. But any restaurant we go to, those fries will need a fat bolus. Yeah. Max loves nachos lately. So the tortilla chips have fat, which we don't really notice if he had, say, tortilla chips and salsa or hummus. But if he has nachos, so he throws all that cheese on top of it, and sometimes even like ground beef on top of that, absolutely, he'll need a fat bolus for that.
Yeah.
Real ice cream.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to jump on your nacho thing. Arden loves queso from Moe's, which might not be all over the countries and everything, but it's a restaurant you go into. They've fried the tortillas right there for you. She buys the queso. We throw the chips away, and she uses like a Tostitos brand instead, and it by half makes this an easier project for us.
Absolutely.
I don't know how. I'll say this, and to people who really are probably believe in me listening to the podcast, I can't figure out how to bolus from Moe's chips for Arden. Like I haven't had the nerve to put in enough insulin yet that those chips need, and I'm pretty aggressive. Yes. So I'm sorry. And you were going to say ice cream in a second, real ice cream, and before that's where people's confusion comes in online. Somebody will say, hey, you have to do this for ice cream. And another person will say, oh, no, you don't. We don't have to. Except there's no context. The one person might be actually eating ice cream, and the other person might be buying something out of the freezer section that's 17 chemicals and might actually have very little real ice cream in it to begin with. So
right. Or what we do, we have here in Canada a brand called Chapman's, which their frozen yogurt tastes just like ice cream. It's awesome stuff, but it's got a fraction of the fat. So when we're having it at home, I buy Chapman's frozen yogurt because then we don't have to stress about it.
Right.
McDonald's, for example, their soft serve is ice milk. It's not ice cream. So if he had a huge one, then maybe we might have to. But like if we go to Dairy Queen, their soft serve is ice cream.
Right.
So it's got a much higher fat content.
Yep.
What peanuts? If he has a great big bowl of peanuts, we might have to bolus fat for that. Compared to any other nut, like not almonds, not even walnuts. I mean, maybe he doesn't eat enough walnuts. But like he'd sit down with a bowl of peanuts, like salted roasted peanuts. Those we would have to bolus for.
Okay.
Sometimes chocolate bars. Again, it depends on how much fat is in them. Do they have things like cocoa butter or coconut oil in the ingredient list? Will make me kind of perk up. All the meats. Pepperoni sticks. If you have like a foot long pepperoni stick, they could have 14, 18 grams of fat in a single stick. Bacon, baked ham. Like if we have ham for supper, probably that will have to be bolus for. And on the idea of pepperoni sticks too, like if you can get turkey pepperoni, it's much lower fat. So sometimes we'll do that instead. Sausages. Yep. Sausages. Absolutely.
Yeah.
They have probably like the lighter turkey ones even have like 3 grams of fat per like regular breakfast sausage.
Do you know what I do that Arden doesn't know? I keep turkey and regular bacon in the house, and if she has pancakes or French toast, I put the turkey bacon with it, and if she has eggs, I put the regular bacon with it. And I don't know that I tell her that I do that. And there are actually times
until now.
Well, she won't listen to this. Don't worry, we're good.
Oh, good.
There are times when she'll specifically say, "I want to have French toast with regular bacon," and I'll go, "Okay, then bolus now." And and she doesn't see the difference yet. She'll be on the show one day and I'll tell her little stuff like that so she knows. But that's just the kind of stuff that I think is intuitive for you, a person who paid so much attention to this, or to me, somebody who talks about it so much that it's hard for me to forget it even, But for most people are not going to think, oh, there's a higher carb value here with some more fat. I won't pair it with the same fat as I just think it's a bridge too far, especially when you're first diagnosed and in your mind, you're thinking bacon, no carbs, good.
Right.
I'm sorry. I keep cutting you off, but you're doing terrific.
No, that's great.
Good.
Yeah. So what were we talking about?
Well, listen,
the calculation.
I want to tell
what
people
to do about all that, right?
Before we get back to the calculation, you're going to have to thank Michelle in your own mind here, or at least by visiting her website, because she's got lists in front of her. And I have never sat down and made this podcast with anything written down in front of me ever. She's trying very hard, and I am just over here going like, I'm
Again,
recording.
Scott, yin and yang. I got to be systematic. That's why this process works for me.
Oh, and that's why I love you being here, because listen, I think there are a fair amount of people who pick up what I'm putting down, like they used to say in the 80s. But I think there are also people who hear it and whose brains work like yours. And they're like, you got to tell me a number or something, and I just don't.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do it. I am literally a person who looked at a plate 2 nights ago. It had chicken and carrots and rice on it. And I looked at it and nothing was measured. And I just looked at it and I was like, chicken, 10, carrots, I don't know, 10, rice, looks like 40, do 65 carbs. I literally counted to 60 and then said 65, which even made me wonder why I counted. Like, why didn't I just look at it and go, that looks like 65.
You have a process to get there, sure.
Such a weird thing. And that's, I do believe that most people can, with most meals, get to it. But there's some of these things that we're talking about today that are they're just too much, And
just on that idea of looking at a plate, like I think we've had to teach ourselves systematically over the last 12 years how to do what you do intuitively. Mm-hmm. So what I would do is I would measure that, whatever, pile of strawberries or that, mashed potatoes or whatever it was, French fries. I would guesstimate what I thought, how many carbs were in it. And then I would measure it and see how far off I was. And then from there, if you do that enough times, now you can start looking at a handful of cantaloupe, a handful of potato chips. You can start looking at that and going, oh, this is what I think. But I had to get there through very systematic, like teaching myself, this is how far off you are.
Right.
Next time, guess a little higher, guess a little lower. Yeah. So I had to get there very systematically, and you do it very intuitively, which I admire, but I would never be able to do with that kind of pull a number out of your bum approach.
Can you imagine that that's my skill? If I put that on my CV, I'd never get a job.
That is a huge skill. It is.
You were able to figure it out in a way that's quantifiable. Trust me. The only way I can quantify it is to tell people stories about potato chips and then hopefully they get something out of it. All right. So just to point out, I didn't figure out how to make it quantifiable.
I took a program that already exists and I applied it to our family and it worked.
Well, see,
and that was a huge.
You're very kind to give attribution where it's deserved. And I didn't mean that you made it up out of thin air.
I know you
But
didn't.
You still went and found it and put it into practice. Like you could have showed me that at a certain time in Arden's diabetes, and I would have been like, I ain't reading that. And that would have been like the end of it.
I've been told I can complicate things a little bit. Yes, that's my nature to go into it in deep, deep detail. No, just as an aside, all of the information on the website. So it's less of a blog and more like an information repository. And only because what you do very easily, sharing your personal experience, does not come as easily to me. Mm-hmm. I'm much more comfortable sharing the information than I am sharing my life, which is why I kind of have a love-hate relationship with social media. But there's a whole other topic for a whole other day. But what we've done on Waltzing the Dragon is set things up as beginner, intermediate, and advanced articles. And this one is solidly in the advanced. It's like not for the faint of heart, because it does look intimidating. But if you follow it through, follow the example through, it makes sense.
Well, let me tell you that anybody who's made it 34 minutes into this wants it. So okay. go ahead and give it to them.
No holds barred. Let me tell you what you do then.
Gvoke HypoPen has no visible needle and is the first pre-mixed auto-injector of glucagon for very low blood sugar in adults and kids with diabetes, ages 2 and above. Not only is Gvoke HypoPen simple to administer, but it's simple to learn more about. All you have to do is go to gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. Gvoke shouldn't be used in patients with insulinoma or pheochromocytoma. Visit gvokeglucagon.com/risk. Look, if you're the kind of person that's here learning about how to bolus for fat in your food, then your data is important to you. And that data begins with your blood glucose meter. Are you using a good one? Is it accurate? Is it reliable? How do you know? Do you just take the one the doctor gave you or buy the cheapest one at the pharmacy? Maybe you should check into the Contour NEXT1 blood glucose meter. This is the meter that my daughter Arden uses. It is absolutely the most accurate and fundamentally easy to use blood glucose meter that she has ever had. You can find out more about it at contournext.com/juicebox. The Contour NEXT1 blood glucose meter has second chance test strips, meaning you can touch some blood, not get quite enough, go back and get a little more without changing the accuracy of the test or wasting a test strip. Might not seem like a big deal, but tonight at 3 a.m. it will be. Is the light on your meter nice and bright? The one on the Contour NEXT1 is. It'll allow you to see in low light situations. And the screen is simple and easy to use. And if you'd like, you can connect the meter to your phone. They have an app. It'll connect by Bluetooth, and you can share your data back to your phone and make better sense of it later if you want. But if you don't want to use that app, you don't have to. You can just use the meter. It's absolutely up to you. Go to contournext.com/juicebox to learn more about the meter and all of the products that you'll find on the site. You know, it's possible you'll even be eligible for a free meter. It's possible that the meter and the test strips will be cheaper cash out of your pocket than through your insurance company for other meters. This stuff is mind-boggling. My mind is boggled. Before I get you back to Michelle and she talks in depth about how she boluses for fat, I'd like to remind you to support the T1D Exchange. Please go to t1dexchange.org/juicebox. Take a few minutes to answer some simple questions and make the lives of people living with type 1 diabetes better. If you are a type 1 who lives in the United States or the caregiver of a type 1 who lives in the United States, this is for you. It is super simple to do. You can do it right there on your phone or your laptop. Again, it only takes a few minutes. It's 100% HIPAA compliant. It is 1,000% anonymous. And the answers you give go a long way towards helping people live better with type 1. That's all you need to do. When you do that, you're helping those people and you're supporting the show. t1dexchange.org/juicebox. Please take a couple of minutes. All right. You ready for Michelle? She's got a whole system here. She's going to tell you all about it.
Basically, you start with figuring out how many grams of fat and how many grams of protein are in whatever you were about to eat. So, you know, for your cheeseburger and fries example, you could go to the company website and see what do they say is the amount of protein and fat in that meal. You could put something at home on a nutrition scale. You could look at the nutritional panel of the packaged food. You could look in a food database, like Calorie King has a book, or there are all kinds of apps that do it. Figwe and Calorie King and one's escaping me, Track 3. Anyway, any of these ways, it will tell you the grams of protein and the grams of fat. You add those together, and then you can convert that into units of energy, which is just kilocalories. I don't fully understand this, except that I know that they've given me a formula, which is to convert the grams of protein into kilocalories, I multiply by 4. Why? I have no idea. Maybe Jenny as a dietitian has a better idea. I don't know. I just take it on faith. To convert the amount of fat into kilocalories, you multiply by 9. So let's say the example that I've given on the website is for an ice cream bar covered in chocolate with nuts. Real ice cream, as we talked about. It's a Klondike bar, ice cream chocolate covered. So on the nutritional panel, it says there's 3 grams of protein and 14 grams of fat. So I multiply the 3 grams of protein by 4, the 14 grams of fat by 9, and I come up with the total kilocalories, which I've got here is 138.
138 for the fat. So that's 14 times.
No, 138 for both.
Excuse me,
it is 12 kilocalories of protein and 126 kilocalories from fat.
Gotcha.
Again, those are just units of energy.
Okay.
You just think about how much energy your body can take from that. So then you add those two together, you come up with that 138.
Mm-hmm.
From there, you calculate the fat protein units, which is just dividing by 100. Again, why? I don't know.
Gotcha.
The Warsaw School people know. Dietitians know. I just do what they tell me to do. This gives me fat protein units. The reason that this is relevant, or why that number is important, is because it tells you how long to extend your bolus.
Okay.
So they have a handy little chart that just tells you if you come up with one protein unit, you extend your bolus over 3 hours. If you have 4 fat protein units, you extend your bolus over 8 hours. So they just got this chart that's got 1, 2, 3, and 4 fat protein units. I just look at the chart, and that's what my extended bolus is. So then we got fat protein units, but how do we figure out how much extra insulin we need?
Okay.
What is the size of this bolus that we are going to extend? And what they say to do is to multiply by 10 and divide by your insulin to carb ratio for that time of the day. I often don't remember what it is. So for Max, like his insulin carb ratios vary from 5.2 to like 7.5. I just pick 6 because I mean, it's sort of, I like to be very precise because there's so many variables with diabetes that I like to make as many of them a constant as I can.
Yes.
So that there's less variability overall and less, mess in the system. But by just picking 6, I sort of acknowledge that there is variability in this, that even if I'm absolutely precise, it's still a different day. It's a different food. It's a different, he's eating different things with the meal.
Right.
So I just pick 6 because it can be complicated, and that works for him. But like when I look back at this example, I was using 15. So when he was younger, his insulin to carb ratio was 1 to 15. Yep. That's a very different thing when he was 6 than it is now that he's 13.
Sure.
So that's where the insulin carb ratio does matter on an individual basis. But whether or not you call it 6 or 6.5 or 7 probably doesn't change things a whole bunch.
It's still a heck of a lot closer than the way it was going to go without
the
this.
gas. Right. Absolutely. So if you do that, you come up with the number of units. So in this case, if I took that 138 and I divided it or multiplied it by 10 and divided it by his IC ratio, which for this example was 15, then I come up with 0.9 units of insulin. So I would have given him 0.9 units of insulin extended over 3 hours, 0, 100, nothing up front, everything extended over those 3 hours. For the Klondike candy bar when he was 6 years old.
When he was 6 years old. And was that the entire bolus, or is the 0.9 the extra on top of?
Just the extra for fat.
Right.
So whatever the carb amount was in the candy bar, I would have bolused up front and pre-bolused. Again, depending on the amount of fat, you might not pre-bolus, but this doesn't have a huge amount of fat. This only had 14 grams of fat.
Gotcha.
So all the carbs up front with a pre-bolus as you normally would. And then after he's eaten, and sometimes a couple hours after he's eaten, that's when the extended bolus comes in. So now, when it becomes a couple hours after is if there's a huge amount of fat, then even setting this extended bolus right after he eats means he will go low first.
Yeah. So you have to understand then when that second wave arrives and be just appropriately ahead of it with a pre-bolus. So you're pre-bolusing the second wave, but using a number that you can rock solidly believe is going to handle the impact of it because you use the formula.
Because I used the formula and I did some experimentation.
Right.
So let me take this one step further and say, and maybe I should have said this earlier for anybody who's not listening to the whole thing. When they use the Warsaw program, they get a really high incidence of lows. So if you use it as I just described it, your chance of going low is what I think and what many people in Canada think is unacceptably high. This is not best practice according to the clinical practice guidelines. And that's one of the reasons why.
What's the number? So
really,
I'm sorry. I find that when I talk to people, one of the most fascinating things is the word low and high is not quantifiable between people. So if you said to me, this will make you low, I would be saying
under 3.9 millimoles per liter, or I think for you guys, I've got my chart here somewhere, that's 70, right? Okay. So under 3.9 or 70 milligrams per deciliter.
Okay. And so for me, if you were talking to me and you said, oh no, this is going to make Arden low, I'd think, oh, like under 60, which would.
It absolutely could.
Yeah. And it could. It's just, it's tough to just say. It's the one thing I've learned from doing the podcast is that people's idea of high and low are different. Like when I say,
absolutely,
oh my God, yeah. Arden got really high after a meal, I mean 180 to 200.
You mean 9, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And when other people say it, they're like, my graph is just flat across the top. I don't know how far over 400 I am. So we can't have
tops out at 22.2 normals.
And we can't have an equal conversation when you think high means 400 and I think high means 180.
Sure.
Right. So I just always like to make sure that we're talking about it that way. So I'm going to go back over this because I am not the target audience for this. And I think I understand what you just told me. So this is kind of exciting for me as a person who could not
test time.
You don't realize how bad I was at school. So, so you take this,
and it hasn't hurt you one little bit, has it?
I don't know. My wife mocks me openly about it sometimes. So, I mean, in that vein, perhaps. So you have this example here of an ice cream bar that has 3 grams of protein and 14 grams of fat. It also has 27 carbs. So you would have taken this ice cream bar. You would have known from experience. I don't know, it needs a 10-minute pre-bowl. It's not too much for your son. Whatever 27 carbs was in his insulin to carb ratio, you put that insulin in, he eats the bar. But then you take this information, 3 grams of protein, you multiply the protein by 4, you come up with 12 kcals, which are total kcal from fat and protein. What does kcal stand for? Why don't I remember?
It's a unit of energy, kilocalories.
Kilocalories. Okay. So you come up with 12. Then you take the fat from the bar, which was 14, and you multiply that by 9, 126. You combine these together, you get 138. You take that 138, you divide it by 100. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay.
That gives you fat protein units.
So then you came up with 1.38 fat protein units. Is that correct?
Yep. Totally.
You just rounded it to 1. Because the chart only really works.
Because the chart says 1, 2, 3, or 4.
Right. And one fat protein unit indicates a 3-hour extended bolus. 2 indicates a 4-hour. 3 indicates a 5-hour. 4 indicates an 8-hour. And
yes.
So you came up with using his ratio. Now, this is the part where I got a little behind. So you took the 1.38 times 10 because that was his ratio. Is that right?
No, because there are 10 fat protein units. So fat and protein get converted to a certain amount like glucose.
Okay.
So 1 fat protein unit is converted in your body about the same as 10 grams of carbs would be.
Okay.
So if you didn't eat any carbs and you ate 1 fat protein unit, that would be like eating 10 grams of carbs.
Okay. This is the moment where I'm going to say this out loud and take advantage of how popular the podcast is. The person who made the conversion calculator for the website, if you're listening to this and you think you could program this into an app for online, please contact
go for
me.
it.
Yes. Okay. And
that'd be awesome.
And you would get that code for your website if you wanted it 1,000,000%.
Oh, thank you.
So then you do this last bit here. You came up with, it's going to be 0.9 because you rounded again, because you came up with 0.92, you rounded it to 0.9 because that's how the pump would do it.
The pump wouldn't give 0.92. Right.
And you extended that over 3 hours. Now, in this specific scenario, how long after the ice cream's consumed did you end up putting this in?
1 hour.
Okay.
So we started the extended bolus at 1 hour after he started eating.
So is that an indication to you that ice cream cone has about a 4-hour life in his body?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
plus the pre-bolus.
Maybe longer, because at the end of your extended bolus, that insulin is going to last for another 3 hours.
Yeah, it's going to have a tail as well.
And I've heard Jenny talk about how fat can affect you for, she said 8 or 10 hours. We have at times found that Max is still resistant the next morning. Like we're talking 12, 15, even 18 hours later.
It can still be there sometimes for people.
Right. It depends on how much.
Right. Not the kind.
And other things like how active is he? How insulin sensitive is he right now? Or has he been, has he had a long weekend and been sitting around on video games all weekend?
Yeah.
In which case all of this compounds.
Mm-hmm. Hey, let me tell you a fun story while we let this sink into people's heads before we move forward.
All right.
2 hours ago.
There is an easier way to do this too. Let me just say.
We're going to get to that.
I take the whole thing and make it easier.
We're going to do that.
Go ahead with your funny story.
Yeah, but Michelle, listen, you got to tease it out. I want people listening through the whole thing. You know what I'm saying?
All right.
And my listen through rate is important to ad sales, just so you all know.
So listen to the end.
I go pick up Arden's contact lenses today. We placed an order and they had to be picked up. And I get there and I'm in an office that, I mean, I've been taking my kids to for so many years. There's a lovely woman at the front who's been there forever. And we're standing around talking. And I said to the person that was helping me, hey, I got to go. I have to go record a podcast. And he said, what's it about? And I said, oh, we're going to talk about how fat and protein impact blood sugars kind of more long-term than people who use insulin, probably think they do. And the woman behind the counter goes, I have diabetes. I've literally known her for a decade. I had no idea. She goes, I struggle with this all the time. She goes, what are you doing? And I started explaining it to her. She's like, how do I find this podcast? And she's like writing it down and showing me her phone and asking where podcast apps are and stuff like that. And I walked out and I just thought, like, how did I not know? But there she was. She had a Medtronic pump on her belt. She keeps it covered with her shirt. She's wearing a sensor. Nobody can see it. And there she was. She's
diabetes in the wild.
She said, this topic vexes me. It controls my life. And she's like, even if I just eat a piece of chicken, I'm down to just trying to eat a piece of chicken. And 2 hours later, my blood sugar tries to go up 40 points. And I said, well, yes, your body can take that protein from that chicken and it converts it and stores it as glucose, and then it impacts your blood sugar. And she's like, I have no idea. I've had diabetes for decades. And I was like, no, okay. I said, so, okay.
Very common.
Yeah. It was crazy. I mean, like if I told you, I just thought to myself, hey, I have a little extra time here. I can make it to the store and back again to pick up Arden's contacts. Like I just tried to squeeze.
And you were supposed to be there because she's supposed to hear your podcast.
It was really lovely. Like awesome. I had a very nice feeling about the whole thing. Okay. So now we just went through something, which let's be honest, is not that convoluted, but it's more than most people. Yeah. Right. So you're telling me there's a simpler way I could have gone through this. What would that have been?
Well, first of all, as I said, we don't bolus for protein. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, because we found when we first started using this formula, including protein, Max always went low. Mm-hmm. And one of the things about protein is that it really only affects your blood sugar in a significant way if you're not eating carbs. And we're a pretty carby family. I mean, I think there are very few times when Max, like he wouldn't sit down and have like a steak and a salad. He wouldn't eat a burger without the bun. Mm-hmm. I would do those things. I have celiac disease. So, I would eat more just protein alone, but he wouldn't. So in a way, because carbs are the body's preferred fuel source, if he's got carbs in there, then it's just going to use the carbs for fuel. Okay. And the protein isn't going to have the same effect as if he had protein without carbs. Okay. So like think, steak and a baked potato, you probably don't have to bolus for the steak, although it sounds like you do and it works. Mm-hmm. So maybe there's something I'm just missing there. But steak and a salad, you would.
Yeah. I don't do a ton. Like red meat, right. I did a little bit, and if it's more lean, I do a little less. I just throw 5. I'm always throwing 5. Like, because how like, kids will put like a little dip in a bowl, like it's a little honey mustard or something like that. People are like, how much is in that? I'm like, I don't know, 5 more. Everything's always 5 more because isn't it interesting? Think, for everybody who's listening, think how specific you are with your insulin. Oh, this is 43 carbs and it's going to be 14.8 units or something, like whatever you end up doing.
You're preaching to the choir
and
here.
That's never right. You're never right. So, and you're more frequently never right too weak than you are too heavy.
Absolutely.
Right? Because everybody...
You're speaking my language.
Right.
We laugh because if we go out to a restaurant and there's no carb information, you're like at a mom and pop place. So there's no, Boston Pizza website to go to or whatever. Yeah. You're there and the food's there and you have no choice but to pull a number out and just go, blah, it's this many carbs. Right. And it's funny when we do that, quite often his blood sugar is much better. than when we systematically count it.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, we still systematically count it because I think if I did that all the time, it would
you'd miss eventually.
Not necessarily work out in our favor.
No, yeah, there'd be
but when
one
we have
time
to, it works great.
where you'd be in the parking lot going, well, Max can't stand. But
exactly.
No, I think I'll tell you a measurement I use very privately in my own head when you're out in a restaurant. If it's a chain, it's more, because I always think there's more just stuff in it that's not food. And the better it tastes, there's more, because the better it tastes always to me means food and means fat and salt.
Absolutely.
Right. So the better it tastes, the more it hits your pleasure center and makes you go, I don't care about anything else in the world. The more you feel like that, the more insulin it's going to take.
Add 5 units of insulin.
More.
Exactly.
So it became like evident as Arden got older. And now I'll tell you, now that she's a full blown lady, there's a whole other aspect of it. There's some foods that hit her differently now that she's mature than they did when she was a kid. And I don't even know if I'm right or wrong about that. It's what it is. And there's some foods lately, there's this simple one. She likes these little baked Ritz crackers, right? So not the regular round Ritz crackers that everybody thinks of in the sleeve. Those we bolus pretty easily carb for carb. But these ones that come in a bag that are like Ritz chips or something like that, I just take whatever the carbs are and add half. If it's 20, it's 30. If it's 30, it's 15 more on top of that. And these things just hit her. I don't know what's in them, but it ain't good. You know what I mean?
Have you looked at the label?
Well, no, that would take a lot more effort. I just figured out how much insulin to use.
I'm just curious about how much fat and maybe even protein is in there.
I'm going to look,
or if it's a glycemic index thing, like if they digest super slowly, then
something, because they hit her like a truck, and then the truck stays parked on top of her for a while.
Yes,
it doesn't pull off and go, oh, I'm sorry. It just stays there. And the reason I don't look too deeply into it, and this might be helpful for people too with younger children, is because she will cycle through these. Like, I don't know if other people's kids do that too.
Yeah, it'll be gone a month from now. So who
be
really
a
cares?
moment where I'll go, hey, did you want some of these crackers that you love? And she'll be like, I hate those. I'm done with those. And then she'll never eat them again in the rest of her life.
Yeah, and you go donate those 6 boxes that you just got on sale.
Yeah. Like, here, this will crush your blood sugar. Congratulations, they're free now. But no, seriously, it's she doesn't do the same thing for long. She's on a grape kick right now. I have 4 pounds of grapes in my 4 pounds of grapes in my refrigerator right now, because she just 2 weeks ago said, "Hey, everybody, I'm doing grapes now like they're a thing. So let's stay stocked." And I was like, "Okay." So
there are worse things. Yeah,
right. So I'm like, "Okay, whatever." Yeah. And then they'll be gone. Like, I'll try to give her grapes 3 months from now, and she's like, "Oh, I don't eat grapes." So, what am I gonna do? Anyway, I'm sorry. So. Oh, okay. There's an easier way to do this.
Right. Okay. So what we do is first of all, like I said, we don't include the protein. Mm-hmm. So what it comes down to for us is that we just take the grams of fat, we multiply it by 0.09, which is the times 9 and divided by 100, all in one step.
Uh-huh.
And then I might multiply it by 9 or 10. So
what's the multiplication for?
That's the 10 grams of carbs for 1 fat protein unit.
Okay.
So because he still sometimes goes low if we use this with a 10, if he's in a good place and things are, he's insulin sensitive and all that's going well, then I will reduce that number. So when he was younger, I might reduce it all the way to 8. Mm-hmm. And so that's another way to, make it more conservative, reduce that risk of bottoming out afterwards.
Well, I like I'm going to ask you to go through it again in a second, but I like the way you just said, if he's insulin sensitive, and you didn't mean that in a bad way. You meant if the insulin's working the way I expect it to work in this moment. So I'm going to get a reaction that I expect. And by expect, I mean ratios, basal rates are all doing what we expect them to do.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay.
And as an aside on that, like I'll notice that they have a long weekend. Like they just had a 5-day long weekend from school. It was teachers' convention and things. By the 5th day, because he hasn't been walking back and forth to school, he hasn't had gym class, He's been spending more time on the computer or hanging around with us watching movies and that kind of stuff. By the 5th day, but probably the 3rd day, really, I know that we need to crank things up a bit.
Yeah.
And if I forget that, then it comes back to tell me we need to crank things up a bit.
Being sedentary to me hits exactly like an old infusion set. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
You know, when you're at the last part of your infusion set and it's starting to get like, suddenly it's like, this should be a unit, but it's 2 units. And, you know, it almost feels like, it almost can feel like a leaky site. It's almost like, oh,
Absolutely.
everything I'm putting in there is not getting in there, is it? Like, but
something's wrong.
Yeah. But instead it's everything I'm putting in there is not having the impact that it should because he's been sitting around for a week or etc. I'm glad people can follow this. This is good.
So on those days, I will absolutely use 10. So using 10 would be more aggressive because you're multiplying it by more.
Okay. So
using 8 would be more conservative.
Do it with me one more time. So let's just put 10 grams of fat in this imaginary thing we're eating.
Yep.
How do you do it?
10 grams times 0.09.
Okay. Should I ask?
Times 10.
Okay.
Divided by the IC ratio, which for him right now is 6. We just use 6 across the board.
So so 10 times 0.09 times 10 divided by the insulin to carb ratio.
Yeah.
That's it. Okay.
So you'd end up coming up with what, 9 divided by 6? Did I miss something?
Hold on a second. Let's just do this the easy way, shall we? 10 times 0.09. Oh, hold on.
It's 0.
Hold on. 10 times 0.09 times 10 divided by 4.
It's 2.25.
2.25. That would be Arden's. Because Arden's insulin to carb ratio is like 4.
4.
So if there were 10 grams of fat in this thing that Arden ate, I would take 2.25 units and extend it over 3 hours.
What did we come up with the fat protein unit? We have to pause at the grams of carbs times 0.09 because that tells us our fat protein units.
All right, hold on. My stupidity is
so that's 0.9.
Okay.
So just under 1. So yes, it would be 3 hours.
For 3 hours. So now,
and I should point out that we never actually would do this for 10 grams of fat. That wouldn't be enough fat for us to bother.
Right.
But it's great for example purposes for nice round numbers.
For round numbers and simplicity, which is clear. But so that's a good point though, because, and why is that a good point? Let me Google something for a second. What did I say? Five Guys fries fat.
While you're Googling that, I just want to point out that they go to a local mall to do Pokemon Go, to do Pokemon hunting, and they always stop for lunch. This is my husband and Max. And A&W is the usual meal on that day, and it has 64 grams of fat for a cheeseburger, fries, and a pop.
Listen to this. This is from the Food Network. A large French fry has an unbelievable 1,300 calories, 57 grams of fat, 1,300 milligrams of sodium. So you're going to get crushed if you eat this, because not only all of this, but the sodium's going to dehydrate you, which also slows down the insulin work.
We never even take that into account.
No
now
one thinks about that. Right?
Start pulling numbers out of my bum like you, Scott, because it's all hopeless.
Tastes good. More. So there's a good example. 57 grams of fat in just those fries yesterday. So leave the milkshake out of it. Leave everything else out of it. When I'm telling you, she used, just multiple tens of units of insulin more, it really isn't that crazy, because in this scenario here, if we just round this to 60, right? Hold on a second. If we just round this to 60 grams of fat for Arden for the French fries yesterday, and I do 60 times 0.09, I get
so that's 5 fat protein units,
right? Times 10, 54, divided by her insulin to carb ratio is 4. She needed 13 and a half units more insulin for the fat in those French fries than the carbs in those French fries indicated.
Right.
And think about how many carbs were in the French fries. So hold on a second. 5 Guys, large fries, carbs. Okay. There are 72 carbs. So we've just decided Arden needed 13 and a half units of insulin for the fat in Five Guys fries. Now let's look at it as carbs. 72 divided by 4. 18. So while everybody's wondering why their blood sugar gets high and they don't understand why it takes so long to come down, Arden needed 31 and a half units of insulin just for the French fries, but it had to be stretched out over the impact of the carbs because of how the oil is holding it up, which we've talked about a million times in this podcast. And anybody who's listened to the Pro Tip series knows the food goes in, it starts digesting, you're leaching out carbs. The more fat that's in your stomach, the slower the digestion goes, the longer it takes, the longer you're slowly just basically infiltrating your blood with with sugar. So, so that really is telling, honestly.
And with that amount of fat, like I said, for the Klondike ice cream bar, we would start the extended bolus 1 hour after. And by the way, we just say, Alexa, she's going to listen to me now. We would just say, Alexa, set a 1 hour fat bolus timer, which usually results in hilarity because she often says 5 balls timer. But anyway, all that aside, we just set a reminder.
Right.
So that we actually do that an hour later. If he had this much fat, if I did that an hour later, he would bottom out first.
Okay. Because
the food would take that much longer to reach his bloodstream.
And the easiest,
even the carby food.
Yes. And the easiest explanation for that for most people is pizza. Who, you know, you look at pizza and you go, this is 30 carbs a slice. You put it all in, and 45 minutes later, your blood sugar's 40. And you're like, I don't know what to do. And you drink a juice and that doesn't work. And you drink another one. And then all of a sudden the fat and protein hits you and the juice hits you and you're 400 and you don't know what to do.
Right. And that wasn't a problem with the amount of insulin you took. It was a timing issue. That the insulin got in before the food did.
I was talking to somebody the other day and I said to them, in the end, all the things that we just talked about here, all we really said was right amount of insulin at the right time. It's all timing and amount. It's always timing and amount.
And fat messes with that in a big way. Because it's not just that you get that high, it's that it takes so much longer for it to digest that you can go low in the first place.
Okay.
Or like you've said on other podcasts, you got this beautiful number and you think, I nailed that. And then 4 hours later, you know, you're through the roof. Yeah. And that's why. Because you might have nailed the first 2 hours of it, but not the next 8.
All right, Michelle, there's one thing I'm still lightly confused by. So it's the idea of 1 FPU, 2, 3. When we did it in the short version, we just said 60 times 0.09 times 10 divided by insulin to carb ratio.
Yeah.
How would I know if it should be over 4 hours or 5? What number would change in that scenario?
We stopped at the 60 times 0.09. So that's the fat protein units.
Okay.
And that was 5.4. So for 5 units, now here's the other thing that we run up against with 60 grams of fat. The chart only goes up to 4 fat protein units.
Okay.
So beyond that, I take the Scott Benner approach and I just guess.
More. Okay.
So for 5 units, I might say 10 hours because 4 fat protein units would be 8 hours. So for 5 fat protein units, I might go 10 hours or maybe 12.
Okay. Okay. So my confusion is that our original number that we started with kept us in the 3 hour range.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Because we were only at 60. If we would have gotten to, is there a cheat in there? Is there a number of FPUs that makes it to, like, in your mind? I know you don't think of it this way, but pretend you were me for a second. And
no, sometimes I do.
Yeah. So like how many kcals would tell you, okay, this is going to be 4 hours? Do you have that number in your head?
No, but I could reverse engineer it. Like 4 hours would be 2 fat protein units, was it?
Yep.
So then 2 fat protein units would be 18 grams of fat.
Okay.
So if you were looking at somewhere around 20 grams of fat, you might say, yeah, let's extend that 4 hours.
Okay.
You could totally just do that shortcut. The other thing is insulin is insulin. So once you know that you're looking at a 4 hour extended bolus, you could do a temp basal. that will equate to the whole thing, to the same thing.
I would normally do that
because
too.
It's actually pump doesn't care if you do an extended bolus or temp basal. It's the same thing. It just draws it out.
Yep.
It's whatever makes sense to you in your head and whatever you can, work with.
So with 60 for the French fries, that actually puts us up into the more like the 5-6 hour range, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When Max has A&W and he's 64 grams of fat, we extend it over 12 hours.
12 hours.
Which I believe is the upper limit of his current pump.
And when you're doing that with a small person, what you're really telling the pump is, I need extra basal for the next 12 hours, because it is it's a smaller amount of insulin once you break it up over 12 hours.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that
so
makes
you
sense.
could convert that into temp basal. I guess my problem with that is like, he's still growing. So when he goes to bed, he's got growth hormone and his basal rates almost double. So for me to go, okay, how much of this would it, to tell it a temp basal, I would have to sort of figure out, okay, well, between the hours of 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., his temp basal would be double.
Yeah.
But earlier in the evening, it's not going to be double. I just go extended bolus.
Yeah.
Just give me whatever, an extra 5 units over 12 hours.
Yeah. Michelle, the way, I'm sorry if you've heard me say this, you'll have to suffer through it for a second, but I just think of, I've found a number of different ways to think about it over the time. There's an impact range that the food has, from the minute it goes in till it's done. And I try to cover that range with a heavier blanket of insulin. Sometimes I think of it that way. Sometimes I just think, just basically like, oh, it's going to be cold overnight. I need an extra quilt. And so, my blood sugar is going to try to go up between here and here because I've eaten something with fat in it. I'll just lay something heavier in the form of basal over top of it to hold it down. I've described it as carpet bombing before, just picking the range where the food is and just try to decimate it. You know what I mean? Just stay on top of it. There's all different ways to, however people can picture it in their minds. The idea here is that this fat is going to force your blood sugar up over hours, and the amount of hours is going to depend on how much fat it is and all kinds of other stuff. And still, what we're talking about, while this method doesn't work for it, the idea still exists that for some of you, protein will cause a rise a number of hours later too. And if you can learn that you can count on that a chicken breast with my meal is going to mean that 2 hours after I eat, my blood sugar is going to try to go up 60 points. Well, then an hour after you eat the chicken breast, you could do a temp basal to stop that. Or an hour and a half after you eat the chicken breast, you could bolus for it even.
So my problem was always, how heavy of a blanket do I need?
Yeah.
And how long am I going to put it on? So do I need that, that light summer blanket? Do I need the really thick duvet? What do I need here? And so for me, using this formula told me, how heavy should the blanket be? And are you going to have it on all night or just through the beginning of the night or what? So for somebody like that who is eating the chicken breast in a salad and no carbs and therefore needs to bolus for it, you can use the same formula, but just the same way that I leave protein out of the formula and only do fat, you can leave fat out of the formula and only do protein. It's
fascinating. And I do mean this in a very kind way. Like, so I would imagine you could take this wrong, so don't. But the people who I've seen ask me for this information, as near as I can tell through the internet, have a similar personality to yours.
What a shocker.
Yeah, no, and
I don't take that the wrong way.
Yeah, it's fascinating because those are the people who hear me go, I don't know, put in more and just don't let it cause a problem. They're like, no.
But when I tried that, Scott, because my brain doesn't work that way, when I tried that, it just failed. And I was discouraged, and I was like, I cannot put in the energy that it's going to take to keep trying and experimenting and figuring it out and trying this and trying it. I just can't. And the other thing is, you have this incredible memory. I have asked to be introduced to people that I have met before, people I have had in my home at my dinner table. I have asked to be introduced to. And so I don't have that memory. So if I don't write it down systematically and come up with a process that works, then I'm starting over. Every time I sit down with that food, I'm like the first time. I don't know. Let's see what we're going to try.
So I can't take credit for memory. It just occurs to me. Like, I just look at it and then the answer's in my head. I don't have a process to come to it. And I can also...
That's a gift. That's awesome.
Oh, please. It's an odd gift to have. But I would much rather be able
handy,
to run
given the kids you've got, that's incredibly valuable.
But Michelle, what if I ran a sub 460 and could catch and was 6'5"? Then I could pay someone to do this.
You'd have a different gift, sure.
But it isn't. This conversation's been in an extended way interesting for me because I can see now that you don't think in pictures. And I think in pictures. No. Right?
Yeah, I think in numbers and language.
Right.
Yep.
And the people who I hear describe me as, oh, it's this guy. He's just really aggressive with insulin. I was like, oh, they think in numbers, not in pictures. Right? I sound like a lunatic who's just yelling like, pour it on, see what happens. And but I don't.
But you do that based on your sense of what is appropriate. And I'm saying I don't have that sense.
Yeah.
So I can take this formula. And then once I know, then, I mean, you don't have to go through the formula every time. It's not like I spend all my time, doing Warsaw calculations.
Right.
Once you know and you have that same food again, you just use the same thing. And I literally kept track. I said, so what was the result? Okay, he went low first. Okay, I'm going to give maybe less upfront and extend it more. Or I could tweak from there. But once we've tweaked it and we get success, well, then when we have McCain's frozen pizza, this is what we do.
Yeah.
Or when we go out to A&W on Pokemon Go Day, this is what we do. Mm-hmm. And so I think it gets us both to the same place, but just a different path to get there.
Oh, no, I think the last 30% of the process is the same for you and I. I think it's how we understood it, how we made the decision, and when we use it, that's yours is more calculated and mine's more like that feels like 5 units to me. And
it also puts me in a position then when I get one that I don't know, and I don't know how much fat is in it, I don't know how much protein it is, I can look at it and go, well, it looks like an A&W meal, or it looks a little closer to, nachos, or it looks like, then I can be in the ballpark. I can say, well, I have no idea on this one,
right?
But I'm going to compare it to something I do know, something we've done before, and I'm going to try this. And that gets me in the ballpark, and it makes Max's blood sugars post-meal manageable.
Yeah.
So that now we can do the bumping and nudging that you talk about, rather than this, runaway freight train that nothing is helping.
There is nothing maybe more confusing than seeing a blood sugar that's 280, putting what you think is a massive amount of insulin on it and watching it go to 260 and then bounce back to 280 again.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Then your brain's just like fried because you're only thinking correction factor and not considering any of the other things that are happening. And then you're just there.
And before we started analyzing this, had no idea. Like I might think, oh yeah, it's fat. But then when you think 64 grams of fat, that puts my understanding on an entirely different level for me to go, oh, that's why when one unit would normally work and I gave him 3 units thinking, oh, let's watch for the low. That's why it didn't even touch his blood sugar.
Right.
It's because we're talking about this astronomical amount of fat.
Right. Because, and obviously Arden's insulin to carb ratio is different than other people's, but because a large French fry from Five Guys for Arden needs 28, 30, like 32 units of insulin, 32 units of insulin. Her pump only holds 200 for 3 days.
Right.
So anyway, this was really great. Did we not say anything that you wanted to say, or did I find a way through it all?
I think so. Let me just look and see.
Yeah, look at your notes, please. I don't usually have people with notes, so check it out. Let's make sure we're good.
Again, systematic. One other thing to think about is there are times that we would have, he'd say, make himself nachos for lunch, and then we'd have pizza for supper, or, we'd go out to McDonald's for supper. If this happens twice in a day, the effect is compounded. So like if I sort of imagine that, his first is nachos for lunch, there's some fat swimming around in his blood, and that's making things a little bit harder to deal with, but we covered it and things look great, but underneath the surface, he's still got that extra fat in his blood. Now we go and we pile on more fat. That's going to need even more of a hit. So yeah, your more insulin really applies if you're eating fat more than once in a day, which doesn't happen incredibly often for us, but we've seen the effect.
Yeah.
And I think I already, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I see it with Arden during her period, like when she gets like cravings, sometimes cravings, they match each other. So it goes, I've had days that have gone from nachos to Chinese food,
Right.
and you're just like, well, this is going to be like, it really does feel like, like the greatest football team of all times has shown up to play you. And you're like, okay, I guess we're going to lose. Let's try not to lose by too much.
And that's where if you normally do Chinese food and you go, well, this is how many units it needs and we need to extend it over this many hours. The day that you have Chinese food after nachos, you need to ramp that up.
It'll change. Yeah.
Or at least we find that we do, because the effect is cumulative. It's 100%. Compounding.
I definitely see that too. Okay. I'm sorry. I cut you off. You're going to say something else.
No, I think that might be, I think we've addressed everything else that I've got here.
Well, Jenny was right. You were the right person to talk to about this. So
thank you.
I have to say this
has
too.
Been a pleasure.
No, I had a good time, but let me say this because I want to mention again, it's waltzingthedragon.com or .ca. There'll be links in the show notes for you to go find it. I'm going to try to talk Michelle into the day that this goes up to like popping up in the Facebook group and chatting with people about it if she wants to.
I would love to.
But I want to say this, and I mean this genuinely. She would never say this out loud, but there are not that many places where Jenny directs people for diabetes advice. So
you made my day, because I really admire her. She is a smart cookie and has great advice.
It was a big deal. I've outed her now. She's only ever told me that privately, but there are very few sources that Jenny will tell somebody about. So that she brought yours up was a big deal. So that's how I knew right away to reach out to you, because if she was willing to say it out loud, then I knew it was going to be a good conversation. So thank you very, very much. This was amazing.
Thank you for your time, Scott.
Are you kidding me? You stop it. This is all the thanks go to you. A huge thank you to one of today's sponsors, Gvoke Glucagon. Find out more about Gvoke HypoPen at gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. You spell that GVOKEGLUCAGON.com/juicebox. The episode was also sponsored by the Contour Next One blood glucose meter. Learn more at contournext.com/juicebox. There's links in the show notes and links at juiceboxpodcast.com for these and all of the sponsors. You can support type 1 diabetes research and the Juicebox podcast. The T1D Exchange is looking for type 1 adults and type 1 caregivers who are U.S. residents to participate in a quick survey that can be completed in just a few minutes from your phone or your computer. After you finish with the questions, and they're really simple questions, I did them in maybe 7 or 8 minutes, you'll be contacted annually just to see if there's any updates to your information and to be asked any further questions if further questions exist. This is 100% anonymous, completely HIPAA compliant, and it does not require you to ever see a doctor or go to a remote site. Now, every time someone completes the process using my link, t1dexchange.org/juicebox, you'll not only be benefiting people living with type 1 diabetes, but you'll be helping out the podcast. Just use my link in the bio, then click on Join Our Registry Now, and then just simply complete the survey. T1D Exchange research has led to increased insurance coverage for blood glucose meter strips, changes in the American Diabetes Association's guidelines for pediatric A1C goals, and even helped get Medicare coverage of CGM devices. So if you've ever wanted to help out people living with type 1 diabetes, or the podcast, or maybe both, this would be a simple, quick, and safe way to do all of that. t1dexchange.org/juicebox. Okay, now I'm on Michelle's website, Waltzing the Dragon, and she has examples here for you. This is very clear and easy to follow. She's got a lot of examples of which foods are high in saturated fat here. She talks specifically about what the Warsaw approach is, and she walks you through an example. Number 1, identify how much fat and protein the food contains. And she has an example here that she used on the podcast. It's an item that has 3 grams of protein and 14 grams of fat. Number 2, you convert into units of energy. It's kcal from protein equals protein in grams times 4 kcal grams. Now, when you see that, you're just like, oh my God. I don't know about you. My brain goes, oof, I guess everybody's blood sugar is going to be high because Scott ain't figuring this out. But if you've got the kind of brain who loves this, go look at it because it is incredibly well. I know when I look at it, I think if my brain worked this way, I know I would appreciate how this is being shown to me. Number 3, calculate the total calories. Number 4, calculate the fat protein units. Number 5, how long to extend the bolus. It walks you through it very easily. Step-by-step instructions. Gives you the amount of extra insulin that you need. Step 6. And then it talks about the end result. She says here, to make a long story short, in this example, to cover fat and protein, her son had this bar after supper. She would first give the usual bolus for the carbs before he starts eating. Then later, she would deliver an extra 2.3 units of insulin in this example in an extended bolus that covered a duration of 3 hours. So you've heard her talk about it now. For an hour, we've been talking about it in the podcast. If you want to see her step-by-step instructions, there's a link in the show notes for this episode, and there's a link at juiceboxpodcast.com for this episode, 471. Now, in the meantime, I'm going to be paying closer and closer attention to how I'm using this idea in our life. And I'm going to come up with a way to say it that doesn't involve adding, subtracting, multiplying, or dividing. I'm going to come up with a way to talk to you about this, and I'll be sharing it as soon as I absolutely can. You know me, I'm just like, there's a lot of fat in this, and then I just go, it's a lot more insulin, and then I stretch it out. You've heard me talk in the Diabetes Pro Tip series. You know how I do it. If you've liked this and never heard of the Diabetes Pro Tip series, I really think you should check it out, because if you like this conversation, you'll love those conversations. The Diabetes Pro Tip episodes begin at episode 210. They're available at juiceboxpodcast.com in your podcast players, or if you just like to see a list of them, diabetesprotip.com. I hope you found this interesting. If you did, please share the show with someone else. And of course, check out Michelle's website, waltzingthedragon.ca or .com. And there's, of course, links right there in the show notes and at juiceboxpodcast.com to this exact article. I'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Best of the Juicebox Podcast. Don't forget about those type 1 related businesses that I told you about earlier. Balance Chiropractic and Wellness in Des Moines, Iowa with Dr. Jen. BalanceChiroandWellness.com. 515-255-5330. Give Jen a crack at it. I don't know. That should be your tagline, Jen. Give me a crack at it. Let me take a crack at it. We could workshop it, but I think let me take a crack at you. Yeah, I think that's what we would go with. Who else? If you're looking for a lawyer in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, PowellLawOffices.com. Check out Lauren Powell, 972-584-9382. And, of course, EdwardsGardenCenter.com, 40 Fort, Pennsylvania. 40 Fort, 570-287-4329. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Juicebox Podcast. And don't forget to check out the private Facebook group, Juicebox Podcast Type 1 Diabetes. And tell a friend about the podcast, or leave a fantastic rating and review in the app that you listen in. And don't forget to subscribe or follow in that app, like, I don't know, Spotify, Apple Music, Odyssey. I found out earlier I was in. Recently I found that out. Apparently I'm everywhere. If you can listen to it, you can listen to the podcast in it. Subscribe and follow.